And now, it's The Law Show on CL 650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law. Now, here's Sterling Fox.
Good morning and welcome to The Law Show here on CIL 650. A pleasure to welcome our guests from Murphy Batista back to the program. Joe Murphy, QC, lawyer and partner with the firm, and Angela Price-Stevens, a lawyer and associate with Murphy Batista. Joe, welcome back. Good to see you again, sir.
Good morning, Sterling.
Angela, hello.
Good morning, Sterling.
On the program today, we're going to talk about concussions and brain injuries, and I've already kind of set something up here because I've decided in my mind that we're talking about two different things already. And as it turns out, friends, I've made my first mistake of the show because, Joe, a concussion and a brain injury are precisely the same thing, yes?
A concussion is a brain injury, but a brain injury may be far more severe or serious than a concussion.
Okay, but a concussion in and of itself, Angela, is always some form of brain injury.
That's right, Sterling. It is, a concussion is in fact a brain injury.
Okay. So can we talk about, give us some definitions here. You people go to court, you fight for people who are injured in accidents. Murphy Batista, well-known Vancouver personal injury law firm, been here since the early 80s. Joe, one of the founding partners. When you've got a brain injury case or a concussion case to take to court, what kind of definition does a court in British Columbia rely on? Because this is the essence of the whole trial. So where do they go, Joe? Who tells the judge what kind of injury we're talking about?
Well, Sterling, the experts that deal with brain injury are neurologists to a very limited degree, which surprises most people, and rehab doctors. You also have psychiatrists involved, you have neuropsychologists. Years ago, it was thought that unless someone was knocked out, they couldn't have a brain injury. Mm-hmm. But the knowledge today is that if someone is concussed, if they are confused, if they're amnesic, if they forget what's going on, then they've suffered a concussion or a mild traumatic brain injury. So there's been a real learning curve for the medical profession and for judges and juries and lawyers is to understand just how it is that something that might appear from a distance to be a minor injury, in fact, caused a concussion, which is a brain injury. It's a mild traumatic brain injury. The word mild, of course, is very strange. It's like if you were diagnosed with cancer and your doctor said, well, this is a mild case of whatever the cancer is, you'd think, what an odd label.
Right.
But
right.
Somehow in brain injuries, the medical community has adopted a range of brain injuries, and the mildest one is mild traumatic brain injury, and it goes up from there. But tragically, people with mild traumatic brain injuries usually recover, but tragically, about 10% of them don't fully recover.
Okay.
So the severity of the brain injury doesn't predict the outcome.
Angela, I'm trying to think of where most brain injuries are likely to occur. Traffic accidents seem to be the most likely, but then, because I'm combining concussions and brain injuries now into the same thought process, so now I'm thinking sports. Which of the two would be the most prevalent producer of concussions and brain injuries? Traffic accidents or sports?
Well, I think the prevalence of traffic accidents probably statistically put that higher.
Okay.
But because of the publicity that some of the famous players have received and whose careers have been ended because of a series of concussions, probably sports has done the most for informing the public and modifying and the views of society, as Joe says, including the doctors.
Now, has sports done this because I remember when I played sports, I played hockey and football when I was a kid, and you'd take a shot out there, and you'd come back and you'd sit down, and the coach would come over to you and go, "You okay?" And you'd kind of sit there in your head and you go, "Fine, yeah, sure, I'm fine." Got your bell rung a little bit out there, didn't you? Huh? Yeah, well, yeah, I did. Are you okay to go back in? Oh, sure. And that was the end of it. That was the whole concussion protocol when I was a little boy. Sports has come an awfully long way since those days, Angela. Is that because they've been sued every way till Sunday and are now doing it out of a sense of legal fear? Or have they been a little slightly more proactive than that?
Well, you're asking that of a lawyer, so
Precisely.
my perspective, maybe. I would like to think there's a lot of good that comes out of litigation, not just for the individual concerned, but as society as a whole.
Sure.
Because people are held accountable. But it's, the reality is it's likely both. It's partial fear, responding to potential liability, but also as our knowledge improves and increases, there's pressures from society all around to make changes. But I suspect money talks, and holding people responsible is very important.
So, Joe, sports, though, has come, a sea change since you and I were playing college and high school sports decades ago. And I'm kind of probing to find out why. And I guess it's the profile, as Angela is suggesting. I mean, we all have our sports heroes. They take up almost all the weekend, every weekend of the year on television. We do afford these people a certain status in our midst that very few others enjoy. Is that partly why professional sports of all descriptions has had to step up and move this whole file forward?
Well, Sterling, I think there's been a learning curve for everyone about the risks when you play a sport. I know if I put my kid into one of the sports, I want to make sure it's safe for them.
Sure.
Or as safe as it can be. But when you look back, I don't know, 30 years ago in the NHL, most players didn't wear helmets.
Right, right.
And if you go back 40 or 45 years, most goalies didn't wear masks. So that just shows you the evolution of the understanding is, listen, if we're going to protect ourselves, we need to have equipment. And now, of course, the thing is wearing a visor.
Yes.
For a player. And you see players hit in the face, especially in the cheekbone and eye area. And I always think, I wonder why that fellow didn't wear a visor, because it just, especially if you're a defenseman and you're going down to block a shot. So there's a real learning curve, and it's both a desire to make things safer, but in professional sports, that's a business, and the business requires them to keep their players healthy.
Sure.
But they also recognize there's a liability, and the NFL in the States was sued by the retired players for their concussions. And there was a settlement of that claim for, I think, $870 million.
Which sounds like an astronomical amount of money.
Yeah, and it went before a judge, and the judge looked at it and said, this isn't enough for all of these fellows who now have these terrible brain injuries.
Right, right.
And so the judge said, I'm not going to approve it. So it's a real epidemic. And in a sporting setting, you don't see the full impact of the brain injury until these people have left the sport.
Right.
And they find out they're disabled and they can't deal with noise and they can't deal with the bright lights. And it's a progressive neurological disease that in the end will end their life.
Angela, I'm just curious because you're from the UK, obviously. Most of our athletes here wear protective headgear. A hockey helmet, a football helmet, etc. In football, or soccer as we know it in the UK, nobody wears headgear of any kind. Some of the rugby guys do, but no soccer players do. And they take elbows to the head and all sorts of other. It's for a game that's supposedly non-contact. It's a pretty violent game. So what happens in those professional sports? Talk about a successful business model. The Premier League in Europe and the UK is phenomenally successful. Many millions of pounds at stake. So without headgear, how did these professional organizations approach concussions?
Well, you're right. Football, as far as I'm concerned, not the American football,
I
but
know.
true football. True football. No, they don't wear helmets.
Right, yeah.
They don't wear helmets. That seems to be the accepted standard, although there has been a lot in the press about repeated heading of the ball.
And there was some talk in Canada and North America here about discouraging younger players from heading the ball until they get to a certain age, again, with the concussion issue sort of the underpinning of that desire.
Yes. So you're right, in as much as there is not the gear that perhaps somebody like me believes that they ought to be.
Okay.
There is more gear used in rugby, but of course rugby is very much more full on.
Yes.
And yes, there are a lot of concussion injuries arising from rugby, but there are also many other types of injury that are prevalent in rugby, particularly injuries to the spine, cervical spine, the neck. It's difficult. It takes time for things to change. It does take time. And I think the UK is behind as far as recognizing these risks and actually being prepared to do something about it.
We're talking, Joe, you were talking about the sports and the prevalence of injury, and a lot of parents mindful of this. And I suppose it's an elevated consciousness. We're now more aware of sports injuries and brain damage and concussions. We know more about this certainly than we did 10 years ago. So more and more parents are being more leery of allowing their kids to commit to playing in some of these more violent team sports, to the detriment, some would say, of the future of the sport. When parents come to you at Murphy Batista with a child who's been injured through a sports injury of some kind, how do you approach that case, Joe, versus someone who's a young member of their family who's been injured in a car accident? What's the big difference in terms of the way you approach and map out the case?
Sterling, if the brain injury arose in a sporting context, then you've got to say, number one, how did this happen? Are we talking about one concussion or a series of concussions? And then you say, how was that concussion or those concussions managed? Were they treated properly? And you might look at the team, you might look at the doctor if a doctor was consulted, and you also look at the parents, because the parents should have some knowledge. And I was consulted by one family whose son in hockey had 2 or 3 concussions, and the neurologist they consulted said this boy can't play hockey anymore. And the parents had allowed him to go back, and following one last check, which wasn't that significant, this young boy was left totally disabled. And one of the parents had to give up their job to
just care
for him.
Right.
And I thought it was a great tragedy that when the parents got that advice, they didn't simply say to this boy, you got to find something else to do.
Right.
So you look at everything, and any lawsuit is based upon negligence. You have to someone acted below the standard of care that they should have acted at. Sporting setting is a much more difficult setting to prove liability or responsibility than a car accident, especially if your client, the young child, is obviously a passenger or maybe a pedestrian. So it's different, but the analysis is the same.
But I suppose in the case of that young man who received a neurologist's advice to stop playing the sport, mom and dad heard the same advice as the player, and the player went back and played anyway. I suppose that young man put up a pretty persuasive case. Oh, come on, mom and dad. And the appropriate level of, well, shall we say, parenting perhaps wasn't done there. They just, sometimes you have to put your foot down and say no. The doctor said, no, don't play anymore. Mom and dad should have said, doctor said no, we say no too. End of story, right?
That's
easy.
Too bad that
hindsight
didn't
is easy,
happen.
isn't it?
In a team setting, there's such a sense of camaraderie that these kids can't wait to get back in.
Of course.
And they will lie
Yeah.
and say, I'm fine, even when they know they're not, which is now why we have protocols where there's an assessment done on the sidelines of a game, and the kid's got to pass that assessment before he gets back in. And if there's any question, the kid is finished for the day and maybe isn't going to play for a while, whereas before they'd say to the kid, are you ready to go back in? And he'd say, yeah.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And off he would go. So there's been a real change, which is good because it makes these activities safer for the kids.
And is there a liability exposure there too, Angela, because the protocols have changed, because you get out there and you get your bell rung and you come off and you're not seeing straight, you're woozy and all the rest of it, and somebody comes up to you and instead of just going, well, how you doing? You got your bell rung, you all set to go back out? Now they can't. Now they have to ask you a series of questions. They have to perform some field side tests and so on. Is that a liability thing on the team if some official on the team does not ask those questions of the player who's come off a little woozy? Is there a liability exposure for the team then?
Well, what the new protocols have done, Sterling, is to raise the bar. So it's set a new standard, as it were. So the industry is now saying, as a result of our new knowledge, our new understanding, we are putting in place these protocols.
Right, right.
So
and all the leagues follow, right?
Absolutely.
Right,
so it's not to suggest it's completely black and white, that if a protocol is not followed to the letter, that there therefore must be a breach of standard of care. I'm not suggesting that. But the protocol certainly does put a line in the sand. And if the club has not managed to cross that line, has not done what is expected of it, it's going to be quite difficult for the club to defend an action of negligence against it.
Sure. And of course, and Joe, and that also the protocols add the dimension for the parents in the stands of, okay, well, he looks a little shaky coming off after that last hit. But now the parents, mom and dad, know that the kid's not going to get sent right back out automatically. There's going to be a question and answer moment or more. And that would, I think, increase a little peace of mind in the stands, don't you think?
Well, it should. It should. The sports are great for kids, but it should be set up and run so that the child isn't exposed to a serious injury.
Right.
Minor injuries happen. Any kind of contact sport, you're going to have minor injuries.
Of course.
But to expose a child to a serious lifelong injury, as a trade-off for playing a team sport, I think most parents would say, well, no, I'm not prepared to take that risk. And the key is the parents understanding what the risks are, and the key is the teams and the leagues setting it up so that it's safe for these kids. Not perfectly safe,
right,
but reasonably safe. Nobody's going to give you a guarantee that nothing bad can happen, but there's a lot of things that can be done to prevent something bad from happening.
Right. Our subject of discussion on this episode of The Law Show with our guests Joe Murphy and Angela Price-Stevens from Murphy Batista, personal injury lawyers here in Vancouver. We're talking concussions, brain injuries, and, well, what happens when these occur to someone in your life. And there's lots more still ahead. Stay with us. We'll be right back after this quick timeout.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.